When using a compass, there are two things you need to know: magnetic north and your azimuth, which is the direction you need to go to reach your goal. In the United States, our political and moral compasses are off track, but it doesn't have to be that way. Come with me as I explore realistic options on how to improve our country. This is Off Azimuth. In 1972, President Nixon was elected to his second presidential term. His first term was mired in controversy as he sought to expand the power of the presidency while demonizing his political rivals. He antagonized the Democratic-controlled House and Senate, blaming them for budget deficits and inflation. A top Nixon advisor, John Ehrlichman, nicknamed the legislative branch the Credit Card Congress, alluding to the idea that Congress was running up bills without a means to pay their debts. Prior to 1974, the budget process involved the president providing a spending plan to Congress, who, in turn, passed bills that supported or altered the presidential plan. Starting with the 1973 fiscal year budget, Nixon sought to control the allotted congressional spending. He dictated that Congress would spend no more than $250 billion, and threatened to veto any appropriations bills that came across his desk unless they adhered to his budgetary vision. To his credit, Nixon understood that U.S. spending had been steadily increasing, while plans to mitigate our overspending hadn't properly materialized. In 1970, the budget sat at approximately $195 billion, which represented a budget deficit of about $3 billion. By 1971, the budget was $200 billion, with a budget deficit of $23 billion. And 1972 wasn't better, still reflecting a budget deficit of another $23 billion. The country was overspending without a means or a plan to course correct. Despite Congress adhering to his $250 billion budget, the spending bill included support for numerous programs that ran contrary to Nixon's vision. Rather than renegotiate with a hostile Congress, Nixon simply chose not to spend billions of dollars allocated by Congress, a process called impounding. Impounding was nothing new for the U.S. presidency. President Lyndon Johnson had notoriously done something similar in 1968, to the tune of $1.5 billion. Since the founding of our country, impounding has been a part of the negotiations between Congress and the President, starting all the way back when Thomas Jefferson impounded funds intended for gunboat construction. The funds impounded were usually small amounts. There was sound rationale for withholding these funds, and the congressional committees were consulted beforehand. Nixon chose to withhold in excess of $18 billion in 1973 alone. Programs affected included environmental protections, education and health services, urban development, and federal grants for housing assistance and welfare programs. These withheld funds disproportionately affected low-income and minority communities. When confronted about the stunning amount of impounded funds, the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget told Congress that the Constitution empowered the President to decide whether or not to spend the allocated money. When asked about his decision, Nixon claimed the constitutional right of the President of the United States to impound funds, and that is not to spend money when the spending of money would mean either increased prices or increased taxes for all the people, that right is absolutely clear. His position stemmed from a debate over line item vetoes within an annual budget. Line item vetoes would theoretically allow a president to approve necessary spending within a bill while stopping special interest funding attachments called riders. This debate came to the forefront of U.S. politics in 1876. During the budget debates that year, President Grant was appalled at the number of additional funds attached to the Landed Rivers Bill, many of which had nothing to do with the topic at hand. In response, Grant wrote a letter to Congress stating that he was constrained to sign the measure because certain portions of it were essential and provided for the completion of projects that could not, in fairness, be left undone. However, the remainder of the bill, which in his words funded works of purely private or local interests in no sense national, he impounded and refused to spend during the final 7 months of his presidency. Grant wasn't the first to acknowledge these special interest funds that often didn't apply to the bill, but he did turn a spotlight on the problem. Congressional representatives would often attach special interest riders, called pork barrel legislation, to the budget. These riders enabled U.S. budget funds to be allocated to special interests or projects of politicians, often skating the line of legality and nepotism. Since 1873, more than 100 separate resolutions to allow presidential line item vetoing have been proposed, but all have died in committee without a vote on the congressional floor. The lack of line item vetoes allowed the congressionally proposed budget to become bloated and ripe for overspending, which is what Nixon used as a justification for impounding an excessive amount of allocated funds. Congress, however, stood staunchly against what they viewed as Nixon overstepping his authority as president. In 1974, Congress approved, with little dissent, the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act. Even the name of the bill was a thinly veiled jab at Nixon's bloated bureaucracy. Though there was expectation that Nixon would oppose the bill, by that point, the president was mired in the Watergate scandal and would resign from his position less than a month later. Nixon signed the bill without any fanfare. The intent of the CBA, as it was shorthanded, was to codify what had previously been a messy process of passing appropriations. Appropriation bills prior to 1974 were often submitted late and often overloaded with supplemental and pork barrel spending. The CBA intended to make the budgeting process streamlined and rational. Rather than the president submitting a budget to Congress, the newly formed, nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office would create a budget based off spending and revenue data. That information would create the foundation by which the respective congressional committees could identify spending resolutions and pass bills to spend the budgetary allowances allocated to them. These budgetary allowances would be identified and appropriation bills created by 12 separate committees, which include Agriculture, Commerce, Defense, Energy, Financial Services, Homeland Security, Interior, Labor and Health and Human Services, Legislative Spending, Veterans Affairs, State and Foreign Operations, and Transportation. On paper, the CBA made sense. Title 10 of the CBA curbed excessive impoundments by the president. It supposedly simplified the budgeting process and made it nonpartisan through the Congressional Budget Office. Through its passing, Congress would have more fidelity on cost versus federal revenue, and therefore would keep the United States from going deeper into debt. It should have worked. Except it didn't. The very first budget in 1975 arrived a month late and contained a $33 billion budget deficit, which represented nearly a 150% increase compared to previous years. Furthermore, the exclusive reliance on the congressional process for passing the annual budget, especially as politics has become more and more partisan, has resulted in Congress only passing the budget on time 4 times in the past 40 years, in fiscal year 1977, 1989, 1995, and 1997. These congressional failures are surprising, especially since the budgeting process has a well-established timeline. None of this should be a surprise. Once the fiscal budget is approved for one fiscal year, in the words of Nightmare Before Christmas, there's only 365 days left. Even when examining the individual appropriation committees, since 1997, Congress has never passed more than 5 of its 12 regular appropriation bills on time. In the absence of proper appropriation bills, Congress instead passes continuing resolutions, or CRs. Continuing resolutions are passed when Congress and the President fail to agree or pass one or more of the appropriation bills. The continuing resolution allows the government agencies covered by the failed appropriation bills to continue operating at the budget level approved in the previous year. In most instances, that level is adequate. CRs can be short-term, as little as a few weeks if Congress is confident they'll be able to resolve the appropriations bill, or can extend through the full year. The CRs operate as a stopgap to ensure the government doesn't shut down. But in years when there have been an increased demand on defense operations or homeland security, the previously approved budget is often inadequate. And while CRs operate as a stopgap to ensure the government doesn't shut down, the weaponizing of the budget and CRs has led to 22 government shutdowns in the past 50 years, with 3 occurring in 2018 and 2019 alone. The tone of our budgeting process, this sharp increase in governmental spending and ballooning national debt, has defined U.S. politics for decades. Since the CBA's inception in 1974, the U.S. has experienced a budget deficit in 40 of the past 50 years. The U.S. debt has ballooned from approximately $533 billion in 1975 to nearly $39 trillion as of March of 2026. But how could the United States, one of the richest countries in the world, continually work in a financial deficit? In 2025, the gross domestic product, or the measure of a country's economy and its growth rate, was $24.1 trillion. The budget for that same year was approximately $7 trillion. So how is our budget trending in the wrong direction? A country's gross domestic product, or GDP, includes consumer spending, government spending, net exports, and total investments. It reflects money being put into the U.S. economy. However, the largest portion of the GDP is held in corporate and individual accounts, not funds that are readily available for government spending. Congressional budgets can only spend against federal revenue, which includes corporate taxes, payroll taxes, income taxes, and tariffs. In 2025, that accounted for just over $5 trillion. The ratio of our spending at $7 trillion compared to government income at $5 trillion resulted in a federal deficit of $1.8 trillion. There is no indication based off current congressional spending levels that the United States will reach a budget surplus in the near future. There doesn't seem to be any great urgency for Congress to operate within a balanced budget, and I believe that's the main reason that our budget has grown so large that it's become an abstract number. The first $1 trillion debt was reached on 22 October 1981. Despite running on a platform that campaigned against deficit spending, Ronald Reagan encouraged Congress to spend heavily on arms while also cutting taxes. In September of 2017, our national debt crested $20 trillion for the first time. Just under 8 years later, in August 2025, our debt was $37 trillion. Only 71 days later, we had already added another trillion to our debt, bringing our total to just over $38 trillion. And 4 months later, nearly another $1 trillion were added. Were that debt to be shared equally among all U.S. citizens, it would equate to $116,147 per person. This is why I refer to our debt as being an abstract number. A common person would struggle to imagine $1 billion, much less $1 trillion. So let's try to put it into perspective. If you save $1 a day, every day, it would take you 2,739 years to reach $1 million. Let's scale that upward. If you were to save $1,000 a day, every day, it would take the same 2,739 years to reach $1 billion. Ironically, the only people who can save $1,000 a day are already billionaires. If we're trying to pay off our debt and the United States pays $1 million a day, it would take that same 2,739 years to pay off the first $1 trillion. Which means to pay off approximately $38 trillion, it would take 104,109 years if we pay off our debt completely. That's if the government pays $365 million towards our national debt annually for over 100,000 years. But let's use a more realistic example. It's not likely, but it is feasible, that the US government could cut spending and pay $365 billion a year towards our debt. Even were that the case, it would still be 104 years before we paid off the principal that we currently owe. It's not as simple as cutting programs to reduce our overspending. To save that $365 billion, we don't have to cut $365 billion from the 2027 fiscal year budget. We have to cut $1.8 trillion to reach a balanced budget, and then an additional $365 billion to begin paying off our debt. And that doesn't consider two other factors: implicit obligations and accrued interest. Kent Smetters, the faculty director of the Penn-Wharton budget model, described the difference in the United States' explicit versus implicit financial obligations. Explicit obligations are contractually binding commitments which are clearly defined and legally enforceable. These would include loan repayments or trade deals with other countries. Implicit obligations are a little trickier to understand. They are unwritten expectations or responsibilities that may arise. For an average person, explicit obligations would be mortgages or car loans. Implicit obligations, however, would be to care for an aging parent, which is not a contractual obligation, but one that stems from relationships or societal norms. For a country, implicit obligations include Social Security payments and Medicare coverage. Despite the expectation that citizens would receive Social Security payments once they reach a certain age, Congress has repeatedly either shifted the age goalpost or borrowed against the Social Security funds to cover other requirements. Smetters estimates that while our explicit debt is nearly $39 trillion, our implicit debt could be as high as $100 trillion. On top of that, our debt is held by corporations and countries, all of which expect debt repayment with interest. But who owns the debt of a nation? Some are held by governmental institutions, including the federal bank. The majority, 71% as of 2021, was held by private investors and companies. However, $7.7 trillion of our debt was held by foreign institutions, primarily in China. These organizations mandate interest payments on top of the principal held. In fact, interest on the debt is the fastest growing expenditure in the U.S. budget. In 2024, the Congressional Budget Office projected that net interest payments would exceed both defense and Medicare spending, making it the second largest government expenditure. In 2015, federal interest payments were $223 billion. In 2021, the number had grown to $352 billion. That number doubled in 2023, rising to $659 billion. And in 2024, it was expected to exceed $870 billion. Compared to the defense spending of $822 billion, it demonstrates how quickly the interest obligations have grown out of control. The CBO projects that by 2026, the interest payments will exceed $1 trillion, with it reaching $1.6 trillion by 2034. That calculates to over $12.4 trillion spent in the next 8 years just on interest repayments alone. These payments are going to corporations and countries, to include China, which makes the tariff war in 2025 all the more dumbfounding. During the financial conflict, the United States raised tariffs on Chinese goods as high as 245%. What that doesn't take into consideration is that there were already pre-existing tariffs, taxes that have existed on imported goods since July of 2018. At that time, the United States implemented 301 tariffs. These tariffs established a baseline taxation of Chinese goods that ranged from 7.5% to 25% and have been a staple of political negotiations between the two countries ever since. When the administration settled at 30% tariffs on Chinese goods, that was on top of the pre-existing 301 tariffs. The Harris-Slowoski firm compiled an impressive breakdown of how those hidden tariffs can greatly impact you, the consumer. Consider these real impacts. Electronic components faced a 25% Section 301 tariff, but with the additional 30% tariff, faced a 55% increase from base price. Telecommunications jumped to 45% to reflect the 15% 301 tariff. Even consumer electronics, which carried the least of the 301 tariffs at 7.5%, then faced a 37.5% effective rate. Tariffs are a powerful negotiating tool. When applied judiciously, tariffs impact foreign businesses because they lose a substantial customer base in the U.S. However, for companies reliant on Chinese goods, it's the importer, not the exporter, that has to pay the increased prices because of tariffs. Our government has assured us that tariffs are paid by the exporting country, and that, in opposition to what nearly all economists will explain, the tariffs will bring in additional revenue into the United States. The administration is not incorrect. The U.S. International Trade Commission showed that since 2018, the tariffs have generated $281 billion for the U.S. government. However, this number doesn't take into consideration the cost of lost income due to trade restrictions. Those losses over the same period are estimated at $1.2 trillion. Our revenue accounts for just a quarter of the United States' overall loss. We've seen that most recently with U.S. soybean farmers who, due to the tariff and trade war, were unable to sell their goods to their primary export markets like China. U.S. farmers faced over $44 billion in losses from their 2025 to 2026 crops as costs rose and the market shrunk. The North Dakota State University Agricultural Risk Policy Center estimated that the $44 billion in losses accounted for about $20 billion in losses from corn, $10 billion from soybeans, and $8.5 billion from wheat, with the remainder being made up from losses from peanuts, cotton, barley, oats, and rice. It's not just that U.S. farmers are losing revenue. It's that the previous export markets, China primarily, aren't going to wait for this tariff war to end. In May of 2025, China signed a contract with Argentina to purchase an initial $900 million of their soybeans, with currency swap and International Monetary Fund support in excess of $5 billion. This new contract represents a significant economic shift, firmly establishing Argentina as the world's primary exporter of soybeans. For China, this new trade deal shifts China further from their reliance on U.S. produce and goods, which, in the case of soybeans, includes prices that are 10 to 15% higher than in Argentina due to geopolitical instability. The contracts and markets we lose today won't reappear once this is done. They're lost forever. Farmers who have been reliant on the international market won't have a buyer. The other avenues by which our farmers can sell their goods are dwindling, driving U.S. farmers towards bankruptcy. According to an American Farm Bureau Federation report, U.S. farmers filed 315 bankruptcy cases in 2025, compared to 216 cases in 2024 and 139 cases in 2023. All that is to say that our growing debt is held, at least in portion, by our political and economic rivals. So when we start a tariff war with China, what happens if they get mad and call in their $7.7 trillion in loans? While there are a few options available to the United States, none of them are positive. The first response would be the U.S. simply saying, no, that we won't repay the money owed. While that response seems brazen, the government may not have another option. With our current budget exceeding our revenue by $1.8 trillion, there are no avenues by which the government could recover enough funds to apply towards the Chinese debt, much less any of the other nearly $31 trillion. The reduction in governmental spending that would be required to start applying funds towards paying off debt seems unrealistic and unsustainable. What would happen if the U.S. simply chose not to pay back its investors? The immediate issue would be a reduction in the U.S.'s sovereign credit rating. Much like individuals, countries also have credit ratings, though the sovereign credit ratings are a bit more vague and not nearly as quantitative. Sovereign ratings are applied by one of three financial institutes: the Standard & Poor's, more commonly known to investors as the S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. The ratings applied by these three organizations reflect a country's expected financial growth and its government's ability to repay accrued debt. As ratings fall below their top-tier AAA ratings, it demonstrates a global hesitation towards new investments in a country. The United States enjoyed a AAA rating from Moody's starting in 1917 as it came out of its Industrial Revolution and became a main-stage economic player. S&P followed suit by providing a AAA rating in 1941. These ratings were maintained throughout the 20th and into the 21st century. During that period, companies and foreign countries regularly invested in the U.S., confident in our creditworthiness. The past 15 years, however, have seen a deterioration in fiscal confidence within the United States. In August of 2011, the S&P lowered the U.S. credit rating from AAA to AA+. While the drop seems relatively insignificant, and a AA+ rating still demonstrates a general investment confidence, the S&P went on to say that the reduction in sovereign rating was due to the country's rising debt burden and concerns over fiscal policy. The immediate effect was the Dow Jones Industrial Average dropping by 5.6%, and the Nasdaq Composite dropping 6.9%. In August of 2023, Fitch downgraded their United States long-term foreign currency issuer default rating from AAA to AA+ as well, citing an erosion of governance relative to other high-rated peers, an outlook of fiscal deterioration, and an unexpected growth of the government debt burden. And finally, in May of 2025, Moody's reduced the U.S. rating from AAA to AA1, their equivalent of AA+. Moody's noted that while the U.S. still benefits from key strengths, such as a dynamic economy and the global dominance of the U.S. dollar, its fiscal outlook has significantly deteriorated. The reduction from Moody's meant that for the first time in over 100 years, the United States no longer enjoyed a fully stable top-tier rating from any of the major agencies. The current sovereign credit report status for the United States is not negative. A blatant failure to repay existing debts, as would occur if we simply told China no when they called in their loans, would drop the U.S.'s sovereign credit rating far lower. The potential impacts are vast, including higher borrowing costs, a decrease in foreign investments, and market volatility, all of which would reflect higher costs to the U.S. consumer. Without further foreign investments, the government's ability to expand its federal departments and programs would stagnate. It seems as though simply telling lenders no isn't a viable option. What other choices are there? Defaulting on loans isn't an option for the United States, as we just discussed. In a corporate or private sector, filing for bankruptcy would be an option to relieve existing debt. However, there isn't a specific chapter within the bankruptcy code that applies to the federal government. Most chapters, including chapters 7, 11, and 13, apply to either an individual or corporation. Chapter 9 of the Bankruptcy Code permits a municipality to file bankruptcy through a reorganization of its debts. The largest city in the United States to famously file for Chapter 9 bankruptcy was Detroit in July of 2013. The city faced significant financial challenges, including over $18 billion of accrued debt. While Chapter 9 wouldn't be an option for the federal government, there has been an argument that another option exists: debt restructuring. Sovereign debt restructuring involves negotiating with debt holders to reduce interest rates or extend repayment periods to reduce the immediate fiscal obligation. This process also often includes moving debt from the private to public sector, which can better handle default impacts. Private debt is defined as debt held by private entities, such as banks, private firms, and private companies. The method of repayment of those debts is more straightforward. The government must pay back the principal of the loan plus interest. Public debt is a little more convoluted. Public debt is often borrowed from national or international banks or other countries. While there is an expectation of financial repayment, government negotiations also allow the federal government to repay debt through a process we discussed previously: implicit debt. Repayment through economic favors could, theoretically, reduce the financial burden on the $39 trillion of federal debt without requiring direct repayments. By shifting the debt owed from private to public debt, the government could reduce the overall financial burden. The question arises, though, can the United States legally restructure its debt in such a way? Despite some strong opposition, 2 University of Virginia School of Law professors argue that it is. Julia Mahoney and Edmund Kitch wrote a 2020 essay titled Restructuring United States Government Debt, Private Rights, Public Values, and the Constitution. In it, Kitch and Mahoney argue that the Constitution does not explicitly prohibit debt restructuring at a federal level. That while the 14th Amendment's Public Debt Clause prohibits the government failing to make its debt payments, they state that failing to pay a debt in full and on time is not at all the same thing as questioning the debt's validity. They go on to point to precedents. In its history, the United States has restructured its debt twice. The first time under Alexander Hamilton and his debt repayment scheme of the 1790s, and later at the start of the New Deal when the U.S. abandoned the gold standard. The problem with debt restructuring is that it must be a collaborative decision between the lender and borrower. Unfortunately, most countries currently providing U.S. loans are direct economic rivals. It's unlikely that, in our current geopolitical environment, we would be willing to negotiate favors in return for reduced financial obligations, nor would they be willing to forgive or prolong debt so that the United States could strengthen its economic foundations. Another option has a global precedence, albeit not one with a great history. With control of the U.S. Treasury, it's feasible that the government could just print $39 trillion to pay off existing debt. It would allow the government to restart with a clean, debt-free slate. While an option, it is not a recommended course of action. The strength of the dollar grew through the end of the 19th and into the 20th century, in large part due to the gold standard. This standard established that all circulated U.S. currency would be backed by physical gold, that the government could and would redeem paper money for a defined amount of gold. This standard was seen as a bulwark against inflation and government overspending. A government couldn't create more currency than it could support with physical gold reserves. It also allowed for global financial integration. All currencies of all countries that adhered to the gold standard represented certain weights in gold, thereby making international trade and investments more predictable. The global gold standard crumbled during World War I, when countries suspended the standard to finance excessive military spending. As the gold standard failed, and paper money was printed indiscriminately, inflation followed. The growing inflation that followed should have been a warning to nations who sought to print money to cover existing debts. In 2019, Argentina sought to restructure its debt. The result was a devaluation of the national currency and an explosion of national inflation, reaching a staggering 53.8% by the end of the year. In comparison, the current U.S. annual inflation rate is only 2.4%. Higher inflation led to increased poverty and reduced purchase power. The Argentinian central bank raised interest rates to stabilize the economy, but in turn made it more difficult for the private sector to borrow funds. In a more extreme case, Zimbabwe faced a similar financial crisis and hyperinflation in the late 2000s. The government printed excessive amounts of money to cover debts and deficits, resulting in the Zimbabwean dollar, at its peak, being virtually worthless, with $1 US being equal to nearly 1 billion Zimbabwean dollars. The bottom line is that there are no quick fixes that will alleviate our debt crisis. If the United States is going to start paying off our loan principal, we're going to have to do it the old-fashioned way, by reducing spending and increasing revenue. We'll start by discussing the first part of that statement, reducing spending. As mentioned previously, for the United States to move from a budget deficit to a budget surplus, our government must reduce overall spending by approximately $1.8 trillion. Doing so becomes increasingly more difficult when you evaluate the 2025 budget. The budget for 2025 was approximately $7 trillion. Of that, nearly $4.5 trillion was considered mandatory spending, which included Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. These programs are also often used as additional pools of money should a department overcommit during the fiscal year. This isn't a recent change. Every president starting in 1984 has borrowed money from the Social Security Fund. The repayment process to these intragovernmental organizations is not straightforward. Social Security still has access to the $2.7 trillion borrowed by Congress, but it's held as part of our national debt. In fact, intragovernmental debt currently accounts for $6.18 trillion of the national debt. Should the United States renege on its debt, that money would be lost forever. If roughly 60% of the total budget is mandatory spending, where are there funds capable of being cut? The answer that most people don't like is the Department of Defense. Of the remaining $2.5 trillion, nearly $850 billion was allotted to the Department of Defense. The budget proposal identified needs to strengthen the Indo-Pacific region, primarily targeting the growing hard power of China, modernizing the nuclear deterrent, and expanding air power, naval shipbuilding, and hypersonic missile capabilities. In a future episode, we'll discuss the difference between soft and hard power, but just know that the Department of Defense is interested in thwarting the military might of China. There are other organizations that exist, or existed until recently, that serve as a soft power deterrent against China's financial intrusions. The $850 billion proposed to increase to $1.5 trillion in 2027, is vastly more than any other country spends on its defense budget. According to the Military Balance, published by the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the United States spends $670 billion more on its military spending than the next closest country, which was China, at $251 billion. In fact, and this is a statistic that is often shared when discussing the Department of Defense, the United States spends more on defense than the next 8 countries combined. And that includes Russia, who in third place has an increased defense budget due to prolonged military conflict. I want to be completely clear about something. I have no intention, nor would I ever propose cutting military service member pay. They deserve proper pay and benefits befitting the incredibly hard work they do. As someone who spent 20 years in the Army and deployed twice to combat, I understand the complexities and sacrifices made by our military. But there are areas of the defense budget that could be reevaluated and potentially reduced. Within the 2025 budget, the Department of Defense highlighted a need to modernize the nuclear deterrent. A recently declassified document from the National Nuclear Security Administration showed that in 2023, the U.S. stockpile was 3,748 warheads, with nearly another 2,000 retired and awaiting dismantlement. The only country with more nuclear weapons was Russia, with 4,500. While the U.S. stockpile has shown a drastic reduction since its peak in 1967, when it sat at 31,255 warheads, the number of nuclear warheads worldwide still far exceeds the amount that would trigger a nuclear holocaust. In a 1985 report by the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, it was estimated that a nuclear exchange between world superpowers would result in 6,500 megatons of total weapon yield being deployed. At that yield, a 2007 paper projected that the smoke and dust alone from the exchange would reduce the surface temperature by 1.25 degrees Celsius permanently, though there would be an intense cooling for the first 3 years post-conflict, which would result in a near-extinction level event. That is a very heavy-handed way of saying that the world would require very few nuclear warheads to act as a deterrent. Modernizing the nuclear arsenal while not addressing the surplus of warheads doesn't get to the heart of the problem, which is a potential reduction in defense spending. The U.S. has allocated nearly $1 trillion to maintain the nuclear arsenal over the next 10 years. That is excessive money spent on an unnecessarily large number of nuclear weapons. While nuclear weapons are one area in which Congress could reduce spending, we need to look no further than our military ground and air fleets for another. Within the Army, the Armor Branch exclusively uses the M1 Abrams tank. Designed in 1980 by Chrysler Defense, now known as General Dynamics Land Systems, the Abrams tank became a dominant feature in ground combat. First deployed in Desert Shield Desert Storm in 1990, the tanks proved to be vastly superior to the Russian tanks deployed by the Iraqi military. Though they had a harder time with urban combat during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts of the 2000s, in the past 46 years, only 15 Abrams tanks were destroyed in combat operations. That is 15 of the nearly 6,000 Abrams tanks that have been produced. The argument can be made that the Abrams tanks, like the nuclear arsenal, serve as military deterrents. What that doesn't justify is the continued production of Abrams. Between 2013 and 2016, production and refurbishment of the tanks at the Joint Systems Manufacturing Center had fallen to only 1 per month. The U.S. Army sought to suspend operations to save over $1 billion, but the effort was thwarted by Congress, which continued allocating funds towards upgrading the tanks. In 2017, production was increased, with the requirement for the center to rebuild 135 tanks to new standards. At approximately $8.5 million per unit, the new unnecessary requirement cost a total of $1.15 billion, not including the extra wages, as the center had to increase its staffing from 100 personnel to over 500, all for extra tank production that isn't needed. There is a justification for modernization in the military. The ongoing Russia and Ukraine conflict has exposed a vulnerability in the Abrams to drone attacks. But, again, as John Ehrlichman said in the 1970s, our Congress feels like a credit card Congress. We're spending money that we don't have on projects that we may or may not need. And if we're talking about military vehicles that we have overpaid for and have consistently underperformed, we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Lockheed Martin's F-35 Lightning II fighter jet. Originally contracted in 2001, the program has drawn criticism for its complexity, ongoing issues, ballooning costs, and delayed deliveries. The F-35 started being manufactured in 2003 while it was still in development, leading to expensive design changes and retrofits to include important things like adding weapon bays. The first F-35 didn't fly until 2006, and it would be 2015 before the F-35 variants entered service. If that was the only issue, then I wouldn't be mentioning it here. Issues continue to arise with the F-35. As of 2024, the cost of the average unit is between $82.5 million and $109 million, not including the engine. The F-35 engine alone costs an additional $20.4 million. The F-35s produced since 2023 do not have combat-ready software. The modernization hardware, the foundation of the upgraded models, is late in its production. As a result, pilots have reported having to reboot their systems in flight because the F-35 overheats. The estimated total cost of the F-35 program since its inception is around $1.7 trillion. There are aspects of the federal budget that can be cut to save funds, but ultimately, it falls on Congress to publish a budget that stays within the federal revenue. If cutting programs isn't adequate, or unwanted as is more likely the case, then the government must find a way to increase its revenue to cover the projected expenditures. Since the federal funds come from collected taxes, then it stands to reason that an increase in taxes is needed. The burden for increased taxes shouldn't fall on the bottom 50% of wage earners within the United States. As of the 2024 census report, the median household income was $83,730. There were obvious statistical outliers in California and New York, areas where cost of living has skyrocketed when compared to the rest of the country. While that doesn't sound like an unrealistic annual salary, the average is a median income sandwiched between the excessive income of the top wage earners and those living below the poverty level. A 2024 healthcare.gov report showed the official poverty rate was 10.6%, with 35.9 million people in the United States earning less than $33,000 a year. In 2020, the bottom 50% of taxpayers contributed 2.3% of federal income tax collected. The top 1%, by comparison, paid between 40 to 42% of the total federal taxes collected. In 2025, the IRS listed the total individual income tax withheld and tax payments combined at just over $2.3 trillion, meaning that the top 1% paid approximately $900 billion of the total income taxes collected. While that sounds disproportionate, it's worth noting that the top tax bracket doesn't even begin until earnings exceed $751,600 annually. In the 21st century, the tax obligation of the top earners within the United States has fluctuated. The early 2000s saw the Economic Growth and Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2001, and the Jobs and Growth Tax Relief Reconciliation Act of 2003, placing a lower burden on top earners, dropping their tax rate from 39.6% to 35%. The American Taxpayer Relief Act in 2013 reinstated the top rate of 39.6%. Coupled with the Affordable Care Act surtax of 3.8%, the effective top rate rose to 43.4%. However, recent legislation has reduced the financial burden on top earners. The 2018 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act lowered the top marginal rate to 37%. This lower rate was set to expire in 2025, but the One Big Beautiful Bill Act extended most of these cuts. If the top 1% is already paying so much into the federal revenue, the question arises, what more can be asked of them? And the historical answer is quite a lot. The tax rate on the wealthy elite reached its peak in 1944, when the tax rate was 90%. It affected the highest earners, those whose income exceeded $200,000. That would be the equivalent of $3.7 million in 2026. The policy had a twofold intent. First, it was to alleviate the federal financial crisis caused by World War II. Secondly, it was part of a progressive tax system aimed at wealth redistribution. It sparked a much-needed discussion in the United States about wealth inequality, something that has only grown more divisive in the past 80 years. If the top 1% paid 90% instead of the current 40% tax rate, then the federal revenue would increase by approximately $1.125 trillion. While that doesn't cover the $1.8 trillion budget deficit for 2026, coupled with other options for reducing spending, we begin to get closer to balancing the budget. However, the burden for alleviating the federal debt shouldn't fall exclusively on the shoulders of the nation's top earners. A more realistic model occurred in 1981. During the 1970s, the top marginal tax rate was 70%, but economic growth in the decade was sluggish, making politicians question the obligation of the higher tax bracket. In 1981, President Reagan spearheaded the Economic Recovery Tax Act. The act sought to lower the top tax rate to 50%. Of course, Reagan would go on to lower the tax rate further in 1986 with the Tax Reform Act, lowering the top bracket once again from 50% down to 28%. While the 28% number is unrealistic, realize that any increase to the marginal tax rate for the nation's top earners would add to the federal revenue. A tax rate of 70% would add approximately $675 billion above the current $900 billion that top earners currently contribute. Even an increase to 50% would reflect an additional $225 billion. In a financial crisis like the one in which our country finds itself, every little bit helps. Beyond individual taxable revenue, corporations also bear a responsibility to help fund the United States government and policies. In the 1970s, the federal corporate tax rate in the United States was around 48%. However, the 1980s under President Reagan saw drastic reform towards both personal taxation and that on corporations. This reduction in taxation on the wealthiest individuals and corporations became the cornerstone of President Reagan's policies. Reaganomics, as they came to be known, sought to distribute wealth through a process called trickle-down economics. He believed that a deregulation of major industries and a redistribution of wealth to the top would stimulate the economy and trickle down to all economic classes through higher employment and a greater supply of goods and services. By reducing the individual tax rate to 28%, and the corporate tax rate to 34%, though the average effective corporate tax rate during the decade was often realized at closer to 20 to 25%. Reagan believed that the wealthy would have greater access to money that would be redistributed into the economy through a higher purchase power and investments, all aspects of his newly redefined free market. If actualized, the changes in tax rates would become part of a series of broader economic policies aimed at stimulating growth. Reagan understood that less taxes meant a smaller federal revenue. His intent was to offset the lower federal income with curtailments in government spending and cuts to social services. In reality, all cuts to social services were countered by large increases to the military budget. The tax cuts, instead, produced the largest budget deficit in the country's history. The nation's debt tripled under Reagan's leadership, reaching that first $1 trillion debt in 1981. Economists have pointed out repeatedly that Reagan's theory of trickle-down economics failed. There has been no evidence that accumulating wealth at the top of the financial landscape benefited the lower economic classes. What happened instead was a vastly widening gap between the rich and poor at a rate not seen since the 1920s. Despite no evidence to support trickle-down economics, the practices started in the 1980s continue today, primarily through corporate subsidies. Subsidies aren't new to the United States. During the 19th century, Congress aided railroads and fur trading, though the subsidies were often temporary. In the 1920s and 30s, the idea of corporate welfare became an integrated part of the nation's budget. Starting with large-scale farm subsidies, the remainder of the 20th century saw expanded subsidy programs for energy, manufacturing, aviation, and housing, among other industries. The concept is sound. Corporate subsidies encourage growth by reducing the burden of establishing new businesses or taking financial risks. A Cato Institute study in 2025 demonstrated that corporate welfare now accounts for approximately $181 billion a year. That figure includes direct cash subsidies and indirect industry support. Good Jobs First provides an insightful subsidy tracker that shows which corporations received federal, state, or local subsidy awards. Top of that list is Boeing, which has received over $15 billion in corporate welfare, followed closely by Amazon at $14 billion. The top 69 companies on the list have all received over $1 billion in government subsidies. While some subsidies allow larger corporations to expand factories and businesses into new markets, these subsidies also include farm subsidies, which help prop up farms that are affected by the inability to export crops and goods. In some cases, though, like the self-imposed limitations created by our most recent tariff war, our government is paying twice. First, at a loss of international trade, and secondly, by subsidizing farms for lost revenue. If Congress intends to balance the budget, or better yet, operate in a budget surplus, reduce spending and increase taxes on individuals and corporations bear the brunt of that responsibility. There are other options that are far less popular and less likely to be implemented. That would be taxing churches. A 2022 study showed that the median congregation for the United States has about 70 members and an annual budget of about $100,000. There are outliers, however. Congregations deemed megachurches, which is defined as having congregations of more than 2,000 members, bring in substantially more. It's sometimes unclear exactly how much these megachurches make, since churches aren't legally obligated to file their financial information. Occasionally, these churches provide insight into their finances. In 2018, Life Church reported its financial information. The Oklahoma-based church brought in $143.4 million in cash and donations, and reported $281 million in assets. Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church published its financial report in 2017, showing that it received a total of $78.7 million and had $59 million in net assets at the end of the fiscal year. It's unlikely that churches will ever be required to pay taxes. The freedom of religion is built into the First Amendment. Though there have been court cases contesting the tax-free status, Supreme Court cases such as Walls v. Tax Commission in 1970 have consistently upheld tax exemptions for religious properties. This approach maintains political neutrality towards churches, ensuring a limit on governmental overreach. There are options to reduce our current financial burden. The onus is on Congress to find a solution to our nation's debt, and the onus is on us, the citizens, to ensure that it doesn't remain a credit card Congress, spending money that it doesn't have. The way ahead is a political and financial minefield. But problems like our growing deficit don't get better over time. Finding a solution to our nation's burgeoning debt isn't easy. I'm not even convinced that it's possible at this point. But if we don't get the spending under control, there will come a time when our dollar, like what recently happened with the US penny, becomes more expensive to produce than it's worth. Thank you for tuning in.